unfortunately, too many people go to the criminal justice system purely because they have a mental health issue. So that's kind of one of the basis for my writing was therapeutic. I went to therapy. I saw a marriage counselor. Even though my marriage ended up dying, it was way better off in the long run for me because I was prone to toxic relationships. And part of my therapy was I need to write more about my feelings. I need to communicate my emotions. And a lot of what I was feeling would just stay inside and never really get taken care of until it became so overwhelming for me that I would lash out emotionally, and I would hurt those that were closest to me. So what I started doing with the help of the therapist is I started journaling. And at first I kind of thought it was kind of hanky-dinky, just, every day I'd do a little bit. And when I got to sentencing, I was expecting to do about 6 months in jail and 5 years probation. And the judge read a letter from my therapist, misunderstood what she meant, and I ended up with a sentence of 2 to 12 years. Not anywhere close to what we were imagining, not anywhere close to what we were expecting, and very shocking to me. That first night that I was delivered to Lincoln, I decided that I was going to continue writing. That was going to be how I was going to cope with my new reality, because I knew that I had at least 1 year to do before I was even parole eligible. So I started writing, and at first it really wasn't anything exciting. It was just how I'm feeling, what I'm doing, who's around me, why we had to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning to stand there and look like we were supposed to be exercising when there's too many people to exercise. Nonetheless, I just kept going day and day and day. And the journal that I had held up just a second ago is actually from February of 2016 through July. I kept the journal every single day I was in custody. The last journal entry was number 2087. I was in custody for 5 years and 9 months because I was not granted parole, which is a whole nother story for a whole nother time. Long story short, I didn't jump through their hoops and I didn't drink their Kool-Aid. I'm just unfortunately not that type of person. I kind of blaze my own path, and sometimes I step on toes, which is actually why my writing kind of was allowing me that outlet. Because you can't really lash out at anybody in prison. You end up in trouble if you fight somebody who's an inmate, and you end up with new charges and longer time if you fight somebody who's a guard. So for me, I fought my battles on paper. And through that method of release for me, I didn't notice I was there for 2,000 days. It wasn't until my last 150, 200 where I realized that I was almost done. And so if you think about 5 years of your life, any period, doesn't matter what it is, try to remember where you were when you started to where you were when you end, and there's so much that happened. But when you're in custody and you're an incarcerated inmate, every day seems like about a month, especially if you are in a place that there are not many options, there are not many programs, and you're just a body with a number, and that's the Nebraska prison system. Currently it's 161% capacity, which if you can imagine this room being shoulder to shoulder with every single person in this city, it would pretty much feel like that. It's terrible. You're living in conditions no bigger than your average bathroom with another human being. And I did that for way too long. So for me, the writing was an opportunity where I made an agreement with the roommate that I had. We sat down and said, from this time to this time, I don't care if you're in, if you want to be out, that's cool. But if you're here, just be quiet for me, please. And together, we were able to kind of come up with a schedule that worked. I was very fortunate. I had great roommates. Plenty of people have really terrible roommates. We've actually seen that with the situation in Tecumseh where Terry Berry was killed because he was an uncomfortable roommate, I guess. But my writing has evolved over time. I grew up in a household where my grandmother was a one-room schoolhouse teacher. My mom went to college for an English degree and got sidetracked and never went back. So I wasn't ever allowed to hand in any homework unless it was proofread about 16,000 times. I got corrections on top of corrections in 3 different colors. And that kind of led me down the path where writing for me came second nature. So when I was told to start making a journal, the hardest hurdle I had wasn't putting pen on paper, it was putting thoughts into the pen. And over time, my journal entries got longer, they got more sophisticated, they got deeper, they got more emotional, and there's several pages that are covered in tears, which I never expected. One thing that did kind of materialize for me was the opportunity to take some college classes. Prior to my incarceration, I was a senior at UNO, and I'm one of those career students who took night classes for 10 plus years, which my student loans are going to kill me, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, through that, I was able to get into Metro Community College. I did some business classes. I took a business law course, which kind of toenailed into something that I had done in Tecumseh to kill time before I was transferred to Omaha. I actually saw a need and became a paralegal. Because of my situation just not being anywhere simple and easy, there was a paperwork error and I was placed in maximum security status, just shy of death row. They apparently didn't push any of my paperwork through correctly. My no contact orders with other people in my case were omitted and just basically told, here's what you're going to deal with. You're either going to go to the same housing unit as other people in your case, or you can accept protective custody. And for anybody who's done time or understands prison, anything related to protective custody is kind of taboo. There's obviously something wrong with you, your crime is heinous, it's likely a child sex crime or something like that. Anybody who's been in protective custody is kind of labeled. And so my first instinct was like, well, maybe I should just take the beating that's coming, go find out what this guy's all about. I've never met him, no idea who he is, don't want to meet him. But as they were looking over my paperwork, they made the decision for me and placed me in segregation. I spent 93 days there, and I affectionately call it the zoo. My writing during that time frame, it was on anything that I could get my hands on because we weren't allowed pens and paper for the longest time. I didn't have a journal to write on. I have several journal entries that are written on toilet paper because I just needed to get my feelings out. So it's kind of come full circle for me now looking back at some of those times where I struggled a lot. And I think that if it weren't for my writing, I don't think I would have done as well as I did. But coming back full circle with the education, UNO actually had a grant from, I used to know this and I'm drawing a blank, one of the community foundations. I think it was Sherwood, but I'm not positive. It might be the Scott brothers. They decided that they wanted to bring UNO into the prison environment. And that's actually where I met Dr. Daniel Webben, was in an autobiographical reading and writing course. The whole context for his course in the university structure with 18-year-olds is trying to put context to their life and give them a direction. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate quite the same into a prison environment where you have 30, 40, and 50-year-olds that really don't want to remember a majority of their life. So it was a very interesting thing for a lot of people to look back and say, I've done this. I may not be proud of this, but I've done it. Whether it was the crime they committed, whether it was their family relationship growing up that led them to their issues, alcoholism, drug abuse, all sorts of things. There were about 18 people in the class when we started and we finished with 12. And those 12 people, I think personally from my experience, had a better understanding of themselves and where they've been in life afterwards. And that's where I started to develop the relationship with Dr. Webben that led us to writing a paper together. And as your little thing had mentioned, the blurb, I'm actually a published author now in an academic journal. Just recently came out, really proud of it. And it's about the Swintech typewriter that he had mentioned. One of the things that I did with my paralegal certificate was I actually worked with inmates who had actual innocent cases, people who wanted to appeal their convictions for excessive sentencing, We even started a beginning of a lawsuit before the ACLU came around for inhumane conditions at our prisons. So what led me to purchase the Swintech was actually doing legal work for other people. They only allow one model. It is a clear case. It is just a bare bones typewriter with a correction ribbon, like he had mentioned, and it has no memory because people have abused the memory in the past by mass producing grievances and lawsuits against the prison, so they took them away. That was their solution. We can keep you from giving us grief by taking away your memory. And we talk about that in our paper because that's what prison essentially does, is it takes away everything that calls you human. It takes away your individuality, takes away your personality in a lot of cases, and they just want mindless drones with a number, not a name. So that was a kind of a real deep part of the paper that we had written. But the Swintech is not owned by many people, and because inmates purchase them, it's the whole reason the company still exists. There is one typewriter company still in business in this country, and it's out of Moonahatchee, New Jersey. It's Swintech, and they sell exclusively to the Bureau of Prisons and state prison corrections departments. It's kind of interesting. The various different models in different states we did a little research on. Everyone is different. Nevada just recently banned typewriters because people were taking them apart and using the metal shaft on the roller as a weapon. So even that was dangerous and scary to them, so they took it apart, which is kind of funny if you think about the whole "the pen is mightier." The written word, or the typed word, was actually used as a weapon in Nevada. So, Dr. Webben approached me to write this paper as a co-author because he wanted to know more about my journey with the typewriter. And the interesting thing is in our first class for that autobiography class, there were 2 typewritten submissions. And he had expected everybody would have a handwritten copy of everything because it's a prison and he just didn't expect it. And so that led to a conversation between the 3 of us. And we actually, the other gentleman and I also did legal work. I gave him a hard time in his because he always used like a cursive font wheel, and it looks great for notes. It's just not professional, and that comes from the family of educators going, it has to be perfect. And it was a really funny exchange, and that's where kind of our relationship began with the Swintech. And over time, Dr. Webben actually got on eBay and purchased a Swintech typewriter. It had belonged to an individual in a maximum security prison outside of St. Louis. It still had his name etched in it. And he taught himself how to use the typewriter, which is so foreign in a concept to teach yourself how to use a typewriter. Nobody uses them anymore. I mean, obviously there are people in this room that are old enough to remember that being the only option. That's how I grew up. I talk about it in our paper because my grandmother was an office manager when I was growing up. And it was the coolest thing ever to go sit in her office and just mash buttons until I got the keys stuck together, and then I wasn't allowed to do it anymore. So for him to kind of regress technology to a place where this was the highest technology I could even use was an adventure for him, and he would talk about it in his writing back and forth with me. And so over time, he kind of wanted to know more about it, and I handed him my typewriter manual because his didn't come with one. And from the manual is actually where we got sections for our paper. It talks about margin control. It talks about left-right containment. It talks about page settings. I mean, all the things that you would expect a typewriter to be about. And then we went ahead and took that and talked about it more in the context of literacy, in the context of the prison environment, and the constraints that we actually dealt with. So I'm going to read you a small section of that, including our little opening, the abstract. The one thing that is interesting about ours is we got permission from the journal to actually have it published as a typewritten manuscript. And if anybody's ever tried to get anything published, it's a nightmare to begin with. And then try to tell the publisher that you want to do it in a typeset, and their head explodes. So you thumb through and it's like, oh, this is printed, and then you get to ours, and it's literally the weirdest font you've probably ever seen if you've never seen a typewriter. This article is written about and with the Swintech 2410cc, the typewriter model approved for incarcerated writers in the state of Nebraska and many other prison systems across the United States. The co-authors, one of whom is currently serving a 6-year sentence, relate their personal experiences with typewriters and typists, as well as connect functions described in the Swintech user manual to issues in community literacy. The left-right margin function reflects some of the institutional and material constraints prison typewriters face. Impression control invites us to think about the forces and function governing representations of prison and prison writing. This writing tool and the environment for which it was designed demand one submit to the process of corrections. And finally, the typewritten performance models and attempts to enact critical literacy and social justice reform from within and beyond the typewriter's cage. So that's just an example of where we took from the manual to write ours. So, Dr. Webben authored this first piece about the institutional and marginal constraints, and it talks about how we originally got together. But I'm going to read just a little bit from him talking a little about the typewriter and how it kind of has survived itself. Like I had mentioned, it's the only one still in existence. In the 21st century, the Swintech company in Monahachie, New Jersey, has secured contracts to sell their devices to prisons in 43 states. While few, if any, competitors still manufacture new electronic typewriters, booming prison sales have helped the Swintech avoid obsolescence. The Swintech marks another ring in the rippling prison industrial complex. Most incarcerated typists purchase their brand new Swintech through commissary for the average cost of $250, which is approximate list price of a 14-inch laptop with 4 gigs of memory. Of course, laptops are banned, though special tablets have been approved for inmate use. The Educational Resource Center at OCC does have 24 computers with towers and monitors. However, these machines cannot be used by the inmates without direct supervision. When and if I am permitted to enter with a flash drive and supervise, my students can write on the computers and save Word docs. The hard drives on these machines are routinely wiped clean, and students are not allowed to use or save anything on the desktop or have their own flash drives. Understandably, most student inmates prefer to handwrite their homework, and I am told that my autobiography class was the first to require or facilitate typed submissions, which I then took on a flash drive, printed, and returned to the authors. The Swintech 2410cc seems outdated, even in relation to the decades-old PCs in the Educational Resource Center. Still, this is the most advanced writing technology that can be owned and kept in a housing unit by an individual detained within the Department of Correctional Services. Therefore, the Swintech sets the margins of our typewriter discourse. With each word, the carriage beneath the line literally pushes towards the margin, beeps, and returns. Figuratively, to the right, we push against the assumption that prisons encourage literacy by removing distractions. What else do they have to do but read and write, such thinking goes. Certainly, many incarcerated men and women overcome significant obstacles to advance their literacy practices and transform their lives while serving time. Recently, Curtis Wall Street Carroll gained advanced trading skills to become the so-called Oracle of San Quentin. Reginald Duane Betts read, wrote, and prestigiously authored while serving an 8-year sentence since founding the Youth Literacy Program and published 2 acclaimed books of poetry, as well as graduated from Yale Law School. Michelle Jones researched and published academic articles while incarcerated, and upon release, earned acceptance to the prestigious doctoral programs such as Harvard and Stanford. Prisoners' success stories must be shared. These stories cannot prove the prison system is a success. Prisons are punitive, sometimes inhumanely. They are not monasteries or writers' retreats, however. Almost all imprisoned men and women have relatively demanding schedules, face persistent threats of violence, and lack writing tools, reading materials, and the quiet space most of us take for granted. Writers are rarely, if ever, advanced by their incarceration. For every voice born behind bars, many thousands are permanently silenced. The issue that literacy can provide inmates, whether it's the therapeutic nature that I endeavored upon, or the opportunity to review their conviction or tell their story, needs to be supported, needs to be nurtured, and needs to be enhanced, especially here in Nebraska. There's not a lot of opportunity for inmates here. Programming is at a premium, especially rehabilitative programming that allows you to parole. That's one of the drawbacks of being 160% capacity. For example, one of the major reasons why I did not get the opportunity to parole was because I was not able to finish a rehabilitation program that they deemed required. Unfortunately, this is a common theme for most inmates. Last time that I had looked at the numbers, almost 2,300 individuals are languishing now in our prison, parole eligible, but unable to complete required programming. That leaves a large gap with nobody really taking the lead to fill that gap, to offer an alternative. And that's why programs like the Writer's Block in Omaha, what Rex is doing at NSP and several other people are doing at the women's prison in York is so crucial. Just giving individuals the opportunity to put their thoughts on paper, to allow their voice to be heard, to give them an opportunity, if nothing else, just to get their story out there. It's one thing to be incarcerated, it's one thing to be a former felon, it's one thing to have a criminal history, but it's another thing entirely to have somebody who wants to hear your story. Our society as a whole has a tendency to look at people with a criminal history and say, oh, you've done something terrible and I want nothing to do with you. When in all reality, much like Trace had talked about where her friend was exonerated post-execution, there's a lot of people in our prisons that are labeled, unfortunately, or are misunderstood, or suffer from mental illness and really didn't commit a crime. So for the opportunity for them to take their story, to spread their word and say, look, there's more to it than what you might have read in the newspaper, that's powerful. And that's really what I'm here today to support and share what I have done in hopes that we can encourage more people like you in the community to just read, to listen, to hear an inmate's story, to foster that. Share your writing, share your passions. If you haven't already done so, find a pen pal group. Write a letter. You have no idea how important mail is to us, and a lot of people don't get it. So that's really why I'm here to share my story. That's why I'm here to talk about my paper. Literacy is key in our prisons, especially right now, to giving people a voice, to express their frustrations, to vent in a positive way. And if you haven't thought about it already, I would encourage you to get more involved than you already are. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. I do not have extra copies, but if you'd like to look at the rest of the paper, I'd be happy to share it, or any of my other writing. You just feel free to ask. So thank you.